Hello, everyone who's joining us. We're just going to allow a few moments for people to join the meeting. So please wait for about 1 more minute. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Welcome. My name is Jill Johnson, and I am the Executive Director for the International Society for Quality of Life Studies, better known as ISQOLS. For those of you who aren't familiar, ISQOLS was established in 1995. This is our 26th year of operation, with the goal of promoting research in the fields of quality of life, well-being, and happiness studies. We are thrilled to have so many people joining us today for this special webinar. A few reminders before we get started. Out of courtesy to our presenters, please stay muted or have your video off during the presentation. We will have time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If you have a question or comment while someone is presenting, if you could certainly, you are welcome to use that chat bar down at the bottom. If you're familiar with Zoom, just take your cursor down to the chat bar and ask your question. We will address that at the end of this session during the question and answer period. As a reminder, this session is being recorded. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel, and you can find that link on our website after the webinar is over. Just a quick note also, this webinar is being sponsored and facilitated by ISQOLS, free of charge and open to everyone. However, we do encourage you, if you are not currently a member, consider becoming an active member. We have a lot of benefits that we can certainly share with you. The member rates are only 75 USD or 50 USD for students or retirees. Membership, as I said, comes with a whole host of benefits, including a huge discount to our upcoming conference. Our conference is being hosted virtually this year. The theme is Quality of Life and Adaptation in a Virulent World, and that will take place the 23rd through the 27th of August. We have over 250 presentations from researchers around the globe, spanning across various disciplines and topics related to quality of life, happiness, well-being. We also have 5 amazing lectures. You can find more details on our website at isqols.org. If you become a member now, you can still take advantage of our member registration discount, which is a fee of only $75 US or 60 USD for students, retirees, or developing country members. Those fees give you access to the entire week of conference presentations, lectures, conference materials, and all of our recorded sessions for the entire year. It's a great deal. The deadline for that is July 31st, so please consider joining us. After this, we'll send you a follow-up email with all of those details. Okay, without further ado, I will turn this over to our Board of Directors and Executive Committee member and fellow member, Gael Brulé, who will introduce the panel. Gael?
Yes, thanks, Jill. So we're indeed thrilled to have 4 speakers today. 3 of them are the editors of a report, which they will present themselves, called How Was Life? So we usually look at quality of life using data from the 60s, 1960s, which is the beginning of the social indicators movement, typically. But today we're going to go much further in the past, looking at 200 years of quality of life. So with our 4 speakers, as Jill said, we have about an hour. Do not hesitate to put your question in the meantime in the chat, and I will take this again at 5 Paris time. Marco and John Layton, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much.
You're muted, Marco.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marco Miradercole. I'm a counselor in the University Center, recently created under the acronym of WISE, where WISE stands for Wellbeing, Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equality of Opportunity. It was a center that was created by the former Secretary General of the OECD, because we have a new one since this Monday. And it was created to provide a platform to advance both statistical and policy work on well-being. One of the key product that the WISE Center will be responsible for is a publication which is called How is Life, which we have been releasing since 2011, was previously done in my division in the Statistics Directorate. And How is Life is our tool for benchmarking and analyzing countries' performance on 11 dimensions of current well-being and 4 types of capital as a way of coming to grip to sustainability. It is based on around 80 comparative indicators that with some of them qualified as headline and used in communication with the broader public. The book is based on a framework that is largely mutuated and adapted from the report of the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission that started working in 2007. Some of you may be familiar to it. It included a number of eminent academics and Nobel Prizes, including Ken Arrow, Angus Deaton, Danny Kahneman, Alan Kruger, Tony Atkinson, and others. I acted at that point as one of the rapporteurs of the Commission. And the framework that was used in the book by the Commission distinguished between well-being here and now in 2 parts, economic well-being / material conditions and quality of life, and then a separate part on sustainability. Now, a critical feature of that framework has been the focus that we have given to inequalities in all dimensions of current well-being, hence beyond income. And so looking at both vertical, horizontal inequalities and different type of deprivation. Now, it has been since 2012 that the OECD have been collaborating with Jan Luyten and the team of economic historians gathered around the Clio Infra project, and building on the expertise of this team, we have released the first volume of quality called How Was Life in 2013, and then a second volume with a focus on inequalities in different life dimensions just a few weeks ago. The 2 books of How Was Life are not strictly the outcome of work done by the Secretariat. We engage in it because we recognize that there was a strong appetite for quantitative information on different aspects of people's lives stretching back in the past. We engage in this area with the colleagues in the OECD Development Center, building on a long association that the Development Center had with Angus Maddison, who had been one of the leading economic historians and in whose tradition of the Clio Infra continues to operate. The estimates in the book are not, by and large, they go beyond the routine statistical production undertaken by statistical offices, but we believe that they represent the best evidence available produced by economic historians. If you peruse through the book, you will see that each chapter includes a table which provides an assessment of statistical quality based on a number of quality criteria. And by and large, we believe that the series, the information provided in the book, they go a long way in improving our understanding of historical development in people's life around the globe. So that's all for my 5 minutes, and I will pass it on to Jan Luyten.
Thank you, Marco, for introducing the two reports that we are going to discuss, especially the second one. But before I will start talking, I will try to get my PowerPoint on the screen. And I would also like to thank the organizers of today's webinar, the ISQOLS Institute, and Gael and Jill for organizing this well, because it's a nice opportunity for us to present our report again for an international audience. Marco already mentioned that this is the result, the How Was Life books report of the cooperation of the OECD Better Life Initiative and the CLIO Infra project. This is the House Life Wellbeing Framework, which has been developed by OECD, that we used as the starting point of our historical work. And what we have tried to do is to find in the two reports historical data which fit the quality of life indicators and the material conditions indicators that are part of the framework. A few words about CLIO Infra. That's a large research infrastructural project funded by the Dutch National Science Foundation, which aimed at the standardization of historical statistics related to global inequality. We have a website on which all the underlying data of the two reports have been published, so you can find much more detailed estimates there, and also a clear explanation how the data have been put together. And this is all inspired by English medicine in a way. And it's also related to the medicine project, which is organized by Groningen University and of which I am also a part. The aim of the cooperation is to present state-of-the-art estimates of various dimensions of well-being in the world economy from about 1820 to the present. It wants to contribute to the GDP and beyond debate, which is so relevant for understanding economic development these days. And we want to add the historical dimension to this beyond GDP debate and show that it also is very important for rethinking historical patterns of development in the long run, that we are now able to make use of much richer data sets than just the GDP estimates that have often been used in the past. What is new in our second report? We have added a couple of new dimensions which were not covered by the first report: working time, absolute poverty, new estimates of GDP per capita taking into account new ICP, PPP rounds, and social spending is included. But the main focus in a way, or the new agenda that we present, is that we think that we have to start thinking about inequality, changes in inequality in the long run, also in a multidimensional way. Most of the work on inequality by economic and social historians is about income inequality, but the beyond GDP debate in a way makes it necessary to also consider inequality of life expectancy, of schooling, of gender, inequality of wealth. And this has been now covered by the report, and we will briefly discuss this also today. And moreover, we have, as in the first report, presented tentative attempts, tentative ways of creating composite indices of well-being and also of the inequality of well-being for the world economy. And Auke will tell us more about that. But perhaps the most important thing is that we have a very rich data source that can be mined by social scientists, by historians. The stories about long-term inequality in the world economy still have to be told to a large extent. And this is some of the raw materials that are available for now telling those stories. These are the dimensions covered. I am not going to discuss this in any detail. You can go to the various reports and see how we have tried to cover the various dimensions of the How is Life project. And we have added, for example, separate chapters on gender inequality. Biodiversity is now covered to some extent, at least, because it's very difficult to measure. And so this is the general overview that we cannot discuss in detail now. But I will, to conclude, focus on a number of conclusions from the report and distinguish between the good news and the bad news. The good news is that there is a strong overall increase in well-being in the world economy since the 1820s. And the differences with the conclusions of volume 1 are not very striking. We have added a number of dimensions, but this overall increase in well-being is still a very strong result, which emerges from a lot of the data. Maddison's GDP estimates have been shown to be robust for various changes in definition and PPPs. Working time has been reduced by 30 to 50% since 1820, which is a lot, but recently progress has been very slow. Absolute poverty has declined from about 78% of the global population to 10% of the global population. And we think you can talk about the kind of egalitarian revolution of the 20th century in the sense that a number of dimensions, gender, length of life, educational attainment, show long-term declines in inequality. So that's the good news. The bad news is that wealth inequality does not show a comparable long-term declining trend. There are some hiccups and some changes, but there we also struggle with the problem of low data coverage. Biodiversity has declined very sharply, but measurement is very challenging, as we show in chapter 10. The absolute number of very poor has remained the same. That's a striking result. So the share of the population that is poor has been declining, but the absolute number of very poor people in 2018 are about the same as in 1820. So that still can be considered bad news. And the increase in well-being is very unevenly distributed over the globe. Africa only joins the club of countries enjoying increased well-being after 1920. But the gap in terms of the global gap between the various continents, and perhaps Auke will show more of those results, are still very big. Finally, I would like to introduce the two remaining speakers. Lamar Krombach is a PhD student from the Technical University in Zurich. He has been writing together with Jeroen Smits and Christian Monden the chapter of life expectancy and length of life inequality, which is one of the most interesting parts of the new report, I think. And Auke Rijpma is assistant professor of economic history at Utrecht University. He is well known for his high skills in terms of the statistical work with data, and he has been a bit the technical central point of the report that we have just published. But he has also published about poor relief in early modern Europe and about other issues related to well-being. I think I will now try to stop sharing my screen and hand over the floor to Lamar, who will do the next presentation. Lamar, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me just share the PowerPoint. Here we go. Everybody can see this. Great. All right. Thanks a lot for the nice introduction, Jan Leijten, and also thanks to the organizers, the ISQOLS, for hosting this session. I'm very excited to be here to have the first presentation of our chapter's findings, and in fact, my first publication, so it's extra excitement here. It's a chapter on life expectancy and length of life inequality in the long run, which I co-authored together with Jeroen Smits from the Netherlands and Christian Monden from the University of Oxford. So let's briefly go through the contents of my presentation. First, I'll quickly introduce the concepts that we use. So that is life expectancy and length of life inequality. And we will take a deeper look at the data that we have collected. And then we'll go on the adventure that is life expectancy and length of life inequality since the year 1800 up to 2016. And because these indicators are so closely interconnected, we will also take a look at the relationship between life expectancy and its inequality. And we will end with correlates with perhaps the most traditional quality of life indicator, which is GDP per capita. So in terms of concepts, I guess most of you are already aware, but just in case, we define life expectancy as the age that a person of a particular age is expected to reach based on the age-specific mortality rates prevailing at a specific point in time. So what this means is that life expectancy is not an accurate indicator of how long a newborn right now could expect to live, but it is a good indicator of the health of a current population. Also, we focus on the population that is 15 years or older because we want to exclude issues such as child mortality. They are important, but nevertheless, they are determined by very different things than adult life expectancy. So we focus on adult life expectancy. Now, how do we calculate this life expectancy? We use life tables, which essentially supply information on the population and the amount of deaths per age group. So for instance, we can see how many people in a given country year were in the group, let's say 20 to 25 years old, and how many of those passed away within that age group. Using that information, we can calculate the average age at death, which is synonymous to life expectancy. And we can also use this information to look at the distribution and see how unequal length of life is. So how many people make it to old age and how many people die earlier. And we could see length of life inequality is the extent to which the available life years in a society are distributed in an unequal manner. Now, in terms of data, we managed to collect 15,144 life tables for 203 country area definitions. So historically, countries reshaped over time. 7,580 of these pertain to men and 7,562 to women. So very interestingly, we have 7,562 annual observations at least on life expectancy since 1800 up to 2016. And this has only been made possible because of the multiple sources such as the Human Mortality Database, National Statistical Offices, but also the Global Health Observatory of the World Health Organization and the Human Life Table Database and some miscellaneous sources. Now, enough about the data and the concepts. Let's delve into the data itself. And so here I have plotted the trajectory of life expectancy over time since 1800 for the different country groups in the chapter, some of which I have combined to make things more clear. Well, let's start with Western Europe on our left. We see that life expectancy started at about 55 or 60 from 1800, and it then very gradually increased up to 80 years for most Western European countries, with quite some negative shocks along the way because of warfare and disease. Then if we compare this to the middle graph, where we have Eastern Europe and Latin America, we see that there's also an increase in life expectancy, and there's a bit of an outlier, and that is the Russian Federation, which has had quite a low life expectancy for men over time. But luckily, we see that there is a very large uptick in life expectancy from the year 2000. So there's a lot of potential there. And again, in Asia, we see this upward trend in life expectancy as well. But another interesting observation here is that life expectancy seems to be increasing much faster than what we have seen in Western Europe. So if, for instance, we look at India, which is the green curve on the right, in 1950, it had a life expectancy of about 50. And this increased to about 70 years in 2016. So in about 60 to 70 years, Indian society managed to increase male life expectancy by 20 years, something that took Western Europe over 150 years. So we see that life expectancy increases much faster now. Then we also have the Western offshoots, that is Australia, Canada, and the United States of America. We see that Australia and Canada have about the same pattern of this huge increase in life expectancy gradually over time, though there are less shocks. And we see that the US has also improved life expectancy by a lot, but from around 1970, it started to level off. And in fact, it's the first developed country where we observe in 2016, at least, a decline in life expectancy at a bit lower level than Australia and Canada. Then lastly, we have the Middle East and Africa, where we have, unfortunately, the least data available, and it's also the most inaccurate, but still it has some value in the sense of levels. So we see, for instance, that the life expectancy in South Africa and Nigeria is about 60 years now in modern times. And this is the life expectancy that countries like Australia and the USA already had in 1880. So in that sense, there are still a lot of gains to be made in sub-Saharan Africa mostly. But hopefully, given the Asian experience, we can expect this to increase very fast once things take off. So now here I show the same trajectory, but for all countries in the sample by gender. And again, we start in 1800 up to 2016, and we see that for both men and women, life expectancy has increased. So in 1800, again, life expectancy was about 55 to 60. And in 2016, it decreased to about 83 in the best performing countries. And for women, it even increased up to almost 90 years. So that's a tremendous achievement to move from 55 to almost 90. We also see large negative shocks in life expectancy, mostly related to world wars and sickness. For instance, we see the large drops during the Napoleonic Wars, but also during the World Wars, and also the Spanish flu, which actually had more casualties than the First World War. If we look at women, we see that the graph is less volatile because it's mostly men that went to war in those times. But still, we see a large decline in life expectancy, for instance, during the period of the Spanish flu. So how equal has this been? Now, we look at inequality and length of life, and we use the Gini coefficient. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, the Gini coefficient ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 indicates perfect equality. So that would be a population where everybody dies at the same age. And up to 1, which would mean that all life years in a population would be lived by only one person, which is of course very unrealistic. And as a result of this setup, the Gini coefficient of length of life tends to be much lower than what we are used to from income or wealth, about half of the size already in 1800. However, we mustn't forget that length of life inequality is somewhat more significant than income, because if income inequality currently is high, one can still use redistributive policies for the existing population to decrease this inequality. Whereas if length of life inequality is high, this already means that a significant portion of the population has died prematurely, a situation from which, of course, you can no longer recover. In any case, we see that inequality is relatively low in length of life, and we see that it has been declining over time as well. It declined by about 2/3 for both men and women. But what is also striking is that it seems to have almost the same pattern as life expectancy, though inversely. So again, for men, we see this large increase this time in inequality during the Napoleonic Wars, but also during the Second World Wars and the Spanish flu. So I invite you to look at the relationship between life expectancy and length of life inequality by gender. And there we observe that these two concepts are very connected to each other. So we have inequality on the vertical axis and life expectancy on the horizontal axis. And in fact, these two concepts are so interrelated that we estimate a Pearson's R of -0.94 for men and minus 0.97 for women. So what that means is that almost all variation in length of life inequality can be explained by variation in life expectancy. So one might wonder, how can this be the case? And secondly, to what extent does length of life inequality teach us any lessons above and beyond what we already know from life expectancy? Now, to look into this, I want you to look at the distribution of male length of life in Niger, Brazil, and Japan in the year 2000. So Japan is the gray curve with the highest life expectancy in 2000, Niger, the black curve with the lowest life expectancy, and Brazil is right in the middle. And so on the vertical axis, we see the deaths per 100,000. So we assume that we have a population of 100,000 people, and we ask ourselves, how many people pass away at a given age? And so how to read this is that, for instance, in Japan, around the age of 85, about 4,000 of a population of 100,000 pass away. And so we see that as life expectancy increases between these countries, the deaths tend to cluster around the right-hand side of the distribution. And when we think about it, perhaps this is logical, because if we want to increase life expectancy, there's only really two ways to go about this. We either increase the share of the population that reaches old age, or we increase old age itself. That is, we allow elderly to live even longer. And while the second phenomenon has been occurring, definitely, the first phenomenon explains by far almost all increases in life expectancy. So we see this strong correlation between life expectancy and length of life inequality because of this phenomenon that length of life tends to be effectively limited at the right-hand side of the distribution. So does this mean that length of life inequality does not give us any extra lessons above and beyond life expectancy? In the chapter, of course, we argue not. And so we show that at given levels of life expectancy, there's still a lot of variation in terms of length of life inequality between countries. So let's say we look at a life expectancy of about 70. Then we would see that there's still quite a difference between the worst performer in terms of length of life inequality at the top and the best performer in terms of length of life inequality at the bottom. And so in the chapter, we term this relative length of life inequality. So it's the inequality in length of life, accounting for this mechanical correlation between the two concepts. And we argue that it is this variation that could show the effects of differences in policy, in health insurance systems, but perhaps also just wars and conflict. So here we analyze these country trajectories for France, Japan, Sweden, and the US. And for instance, the way that we go about this is that France has a relatively high inequality at lower levels of life expectancy. So we have life expectancy again on the horizontal axis and inequality on the vertical axis. And then this relative inequality seems to decline, right? So the more you are in the middle, the more neutral you are in terms of inequality compared to other country years in which life expectancy was about the same. In Japan, interestingly, we see large differences in gender. So we see that life was much more unequal for women at lower levels of life expectancy than it was for men, perhaps due to maternal mortality rates. But of course, over time, luckily, this has decreased, and now inequality in women is slightly lower than that for men. Sweden traditionally has had a quite low relative length of life inequality, but it was relatively high in the life expectancies of 60 and 70. And the US has mostly been in the middle, but has recently been a bit more unequal relative to its peers. So this doesn't mean that these countries are very unequal. In fact, they have become much more equal, but relative to similar groups, they have become more unequal over time. And then lastly, we have the correlates with GDP per capita. Of course, at the start of the period, we have so few observations that it's difficult to supply an accurate correlation coefficient. So my expert opinion would be that the correlation between length of life and life expectancy would be somewhere between -1 and 1 in 1800, which of course does not tell us anything. But from 1900 or so, we see definite significant correlations between both life expectancy and length of life inequality and GDP per capita. So So from 1900 or so, the correlation between life expectancy and GDP has been a significant 0.5 for both men and women, indicating that societies where income is larger, people tend to live longer, and where people tend to live longer, income is larger. And of course, given that these two concepts are so interrelated, we observe the same but the inverse correlation for length of life inequality. So to sum things up, since 1800, life expectancy has increased by a lot in the developed countries, but also in developing countries, from 55 to 81 for men and from 57 to 87 for women. So that's an increase of about 50%. So that's a tremendous achievement, and we should be very happy about that. Also, recent improvements in life expectancy have occurred much faster. So that is it's very good news for countries that still have a lot of potential, like those in sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, inequality in length of life has dropped substantially by about 2/3 for both men and women. But of course, as I showed you, much of this is caused by this interrelation between life expectancy and length of life inequality, right? By the fact that it is easier to increase the share of population reaching old age than it is to increase old age itself. However, we have showed that there remains substantial variation in length of life inequality for given levels of life expectancy. We hope that we convinced you that this information could also be used to see the effects of policy, etc. So thank you very much. That was my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed. And of course, lastly, again, these data are all freely available on the Clio Infra website.
All right, I think I should continue now. We're turning it into quite a lengthy talking bit for you, but well, we hope it's interesting enough to keep listening. So, all right, I'm up now, and I am going to talk about a composite view on inequality and well-being. I see it's doing something very surprising. So I'm, that's how online presenting sometimes goes. Sorry about that, people, but I will persevere nonetheless rather than try and fix it now. Okay, so this is the final and summarizing chapter of the new How Was Life volume. And it basically tries to integrate the findings from this and the previous volume. And there's something of a need for that, because if you take the two volumes together and all the work that the authors, the team at Clio Infra, How Was Life, the OECD has done, you end up with a lot of data and a lot of analyses. And you kind of want to find your way through that. And this is sort of a point you could make more generally, the whole beyond GDP agenda. As it becomes more successful, you also end up with a lot of data that you need to keep track of. And so you want to think a bit about how you summarize all these things. And we'll do that over the next 19 minutes or so. So a few final points before I really get started. One thing is, so I summarize a lot of the work from the various chapters, but I don't have forever, so sometimes I will not reflect all the exact things that are said in the individual chapters, and I would very much encourage everyone, if you find something particularly interesting, look up the original chapter and you'll find much more detail. I also want to thank all the authors, of course, for collecting, creating, and sending the data to make this final chapter possible. And one final point before I get started. I can only stay here until roughly 17:20. So if you have a question that you really want to ask about this presentation, then don't wait until the very end, because I might have left. Okay, and so I'm going to move to the next slide in a very unconventional way, but there we have it. Okay, so what are we going to do over the next, what are we going to do? Well, I'm going to go very briefly through some general trends of How Was Life 1 and How Was Life 2, just very briefly showing what's happening. I want to showcase some of the new data in How Was Life 2, and then I want to get to the meat of the presentation, which is really about focusing on the question to what happened to within country well-being inequality. So that's one of the new data collected for the second How Was Life volume. And the final point, which Jan Luijten already announced, is we're going to look at a set of composite indicators we created to summarize all this data and see what developments they show. Okay. Let's see. Okay. You know what? I'm going to try and fix this in just one way, which is by, yes, I think this is slightly less bad than me sliding from left to right all the time. Okay. Sorry about the technical hiccup. It wouldn't be a Zoominar without one. Okay, so generally, some of the trends we saw in the data from How Was Life 1 is, and I want to emphasize one thing just very briefly, there's all sorts of details, but time is limited, is generally what we talked about in How Was Life 1 was a story of progress. For instance, if you look at the top row of indicators, these, as you can see, are population-weighted global averages based on this data for 8 indicators. And what you see, for instance, in the top row, where higher is better, is what you see are increases across the board. Also, for instance, in political freedoms, democracy indicators, or GDP in the bottom row, it's still a story of progress. Only in the case of inequality and homicides is the story slightly differently. But generally, the story is one of progress. And I want to emphasize 2 more things from the How Was Life 1 volume, that unlike when you look at global progress in terms of GDP per capita or maybe some other income measure, what you see is that this progress is fairly widely spread. Most countries, that's something that's sort of difficult to show in the previous set of graphs, but you have to take my word for it. Most countries have made substantial progress on a number of indicators. And this is also something that Lamar emphasized for life expectancy in his in the chapter he presented. That said, it's not just a nice story. What's also the case is that significant differences between world regions remain, as we'll see not too long from now. Okay, so we added some new data in How Was Life 2. Jan Luijten already mentioned some of these, so I'm going to go through it fairly quickly. A couple of level variables have been added to contrast with the inequality variables. There was data added on working hours, which I personally found very interesting to see. There's poverty data on social spending, wealth, biodiversity, and a special emphasis on the chapter on inequality data by looking at inequality in education, inequality in wealth, and inequality in longevity or life expectancy, as was treated in the previous presentation. Okay, so what do some of these indicators look like? Well, again, and that's something How Was Life 2 tends to confirm some of the things we already seen in How Was Life 1. It's again a story of generally progress. So it's a bit of a mix and match here, that sometimes up is good and sometimes bad is, sometimes down is good. But if you look at the inequality indicators, for instance, so that's just the length of life inequality that Lamar presented. But if you look at educational inequality, you see similar things. They go down, and down means less inequality, which we would generally prefer. Poverty also going down, as Jan Luijten mentioned. Working hours, once we have enough data to make proper global estimates, it's also going down. It's just in the income and wealth inequality indicators, which were the most important additions. The income inequality, by the way, is from the previous chapter. Sorry about that. That is where we see a story where progress is less clear, absent even. I also briefly want to mention the correlations with GDP per capita. So I won't talk about this one because this is the exact same one as Lamar just showed. But generally, we do find some correlations with GDP per capita, which show that as countries become more economically developed, the other indicators tend to improve as well. So we see this, for instance, for poverty or educational inequality, sort of for working hours, though the data is quite noisy, so it's not always easy, clear to say that the what you find is significantly different from zero. However, in terms of income inequality or wealth inequality, two of the new inequality indicator in this chapter, such a relation is not quite as easy to find. So these correlations with GDP per capita are present, but they don't tell the whole story. And for some indicators, it's not quite as strong as you would expect. For instance, the correlation with the poverty indicator is, well, just below -0.5, which is not sort of the story you would see in papers like the one by Dollar and Kraai. Okay, let's look a bit closer though at well-being inequalities, one of the more general additions to this volume. So I want to go through a couple of graphs, about 4 of them, and talk a bit about what were the trends in well-being inequalities, what were some of the important changing points, and again, that question in a bit more detail, what is the relation between well-being inequality and levels of economic development? Well, what we find here is well, sort of similar to what I showed 2 slides ago, because these are sort of scatter plots of the same data, of course. But what you see on the top row is that generally between income inequality and wealth inequality, the relation with GDP per capita is, well, either flat or very non-linear. We've tried to fit some sort of polynomial on it, but what you see is that there's not a very clear pattern, and saying that there is no pattern would be similar. So, of course, that doesn't mean there's no conclusion. As countries become more economically developed, there is no guarantee that inequality in terms of income or wealth will decrease. For the other 2 inequality indicators added to this volume, the story is different. I won't talk about the length of life inequality, because that would be repeating parts of the previous presentation, but I will just say that for educational inequality, we find the same thing as Lamar showed for length of life inequality. And I would emphasize here, though, that at the sort of correlation you see here between educational inequality and GDP per capita is, as is the case for length of life inequality, it is in part driven between the strong correlation between the levels and the inequality in these indicators. And so much like in the case of inequality and life expectancy, there is a mechanistic correlation between the 2 of them, and because the levels of average years of education are strongly correlated with GDP, you see that again here. So I also have a couple of graphs where we can look at the regional change in the Gini coefficients here for income inequality, but I'll also show it for educational inequality. And so what you see here is the change in the Gini coefficient. So below 0 means that inequality is decreasing. Above 0, as for instance here, means that inequality is increasing. And if, for instance, we then look at the graph for the entire world, but this is not replicated in all regions, of course, but for the sake of time, we'll look at this one only for now. For instance, for income inequality, indeed, we see some evidence of what you'd like to call the egalitarian revolution of the 20th century, namely that shortly after the First World War, we see that the change is generally below 0, so inequality is decreasing. And then roughly from the 1970s onwards, this changes and inequality starts increasing again. So for educational inequality, with the caveats I just mentioned, the story is of course slightly different. Now pretty much 0 is at the top here. So across the board, educational inequality is decreasing. All we can really say is that there is a slowdown in the last 2 decades, but still educational inequality is decreasing. And a similar story, though, with not quite the same data coverage as the educational data, can be told for length of life inequality. I want to mention one final thing about trends in inequality in the world economy, which is about whether there is any convergence between countries which were very unequal and which were very equal at the start of our period. And so in this graph, we compare countries with high inequality with countries with low inequality in 1910. And then, for instance, in the case of educational inequality, you can see that they grow. They both decline, but they grow closer to each other. The trend in income inequality is far less clear, but still they grow towards each other. Similar story as for educational inequality can be seen for length of life inequality. So this slide just sort of summarizes what I just mentioned. So again, for the sake of time, because I have about 4 slides to go, well, maybe we should make that about 5. But this basically summarizes what I just told. So I'm going to continue and use the last few minutes to talk about the set of composite indicators we created in this chapter to try and summarize a lot of the trends I've been trying to talk about for the past 10 minutes. Okay, so the approach here is to create 2 separate composite indicators to summarize the findings, because we noticed that the 2 sets of indicators were very distinct. One for the country levels of well-being and one for the within country inequalities of well-being. These are, of course, quite distinct, and we create 2 separate composite indicators to handle them. That said, I do really feel that ideally you'd be able to create, to have a more principled way of combining the 2 concepts, which I'll briefly return to in the final slide. Okay, so why do we choose to make these composite indicators? Because, of course, they're not they can be controversial. Some people have very strong opinions about that you should not make them. We do think they are useful, though, because the basic reason is that one way or another, summaries from the data will be made. Maybe that is some executive summary, which highlights a couple of points, but not others. Or maybe it's because the reader, him or herself, reads certain bits and remembers certain bits, but not other bits. And of course, the authors have to make choices in which things they emphasize and which they don't. And generally, making one of these indicators is an attempt to do these things systematically. Okay, the approach taken here is model-based. We use a factor model, which tries to create one variable from a set of variables. It tries to capture the shared information, and it does this by assuming they are some sort of realization of an underlying variable. This specific model is a factor model, but the idea behind, for example, principal components analysis or latent variable models in general are all fairly similar in the ideas behind it, even if the technical execution is slightly different. This approach has a couple of advantages. One is that you can take uncertainty on board. Statistical models always allow you to do that, and that can be nice, especially as sometimes the data we have is imperfect. Marco mentioned this in his introduction. This is not gathered by statistical agencies, because often the statistical agencies didn't exist yet. It's also important to handle missing data, because of course for a composite indicator you need observations on all your variables, and if you miss one you can't estimate it, so you need to do something with missing data, and these models, the specific one estimated here, also allows us to handle that. And what's also nice is that the indicators rolling out of the model in the end are in the end a simple linear aggregation of the data. And that means that sort of the critique of Ravaillon from 2012 about non-linear aggregation forms doesn't necessarily apply here, because all the trade-offs are nice and linear. So that's also a nice thing to have. There is one big disadvantage, of course. If you apply one of these models, there is absolutely no guarantee that the weights are sort of the correct ones, the true ones. And especially what you could say is because a model like this favors variables which are highly correlated, you sort of even go against the spirit of the Beyond GDP agenda, which says, oh, well-being is multidimensional and you need to look at various aspects. And that includes the possibility that something is important for well-being, which does not have a very strong correlation with other things. In fact, that might motivate why we do this in the first place. The factor model would actually downweight indicators like this. Okay, that's enough explanation. Let's look at some of the things we see when looking at these things, and then I'll try to wrap up at exactly 5 o'clock, which would be unique for me. Usually I'm just a little bit late. So what happens when you try to estimate a factor model like this and try to create regional estimates? Well, this is one of the sources for why we always emphasize with the How is Life volumes that it is a story of progress. Every world region we look at, we see substantial progress in this composite indicator of levels of well-being. Even regions which typically tend to have lower levels of development, which tend to have less progress, so South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, are at least considerably better off than they were in 1820 or 1900. And what you also see that typically the point really where stagnation turns into progress tends to be roughly at the end of the 19th, start of the 20th century. Okay, and as mentioned, we have done a similar exercise for a set of composite indicators of inequalities. And here sort of the picture is similar in the sense that now going down is good because high is high inequality and low is low inequality. And you see that most regions become less unequal. A couple of things here are worth mentioning further. One being that the change point tends to be a bit later. It tends to be roughly around in the 1940s and 1950s. And what I also think is important to mention here is because this is a composite indicator of a number of these inequality indicators, it means that the ones which have less clear trends over this entire period, so that's especially income inequality compared with the other inequality indicators that we've included, so educational inequality, length of life inequality. These are not, these have a relatively low weight simply because there are additional of these other indicators which show a far stronger trend. If you just look at income inequality, the picture is not as clear as this. Okay, this slide just summarizes what the previous one said. So again, I'm not gonna read it out. Rather, I'll look at just one more slide, and Gail has appeared, which means I need to wrap up. That is an excellent reminder, even without the little cards. I just quickly want to show what does the relationship between this composite indicator and GDP per capita looks like. Okay, well, it's a pretty a segmented relation is one way of looking at this, which means that at low levels of GDP per capita, increases tend to be pretty high. So if you go from a low level to a slightly less low level, there's a pretty strong increase in the composite indicator associated with it. And at higher levels of GDP, this increase becomes slower. You could also fit this to the logarithm of GDP per capita, and then you get a pretty straight fit, which means that you need to keep doubling GDP per capita to get the same absolute increase in per capita GDP. If you look at the inequalities, you see the reverse relationship, but I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I think I need to wrap up. So I'm going to the conclusions, and then I'm a minute late after all, so very sorry about that. But I just want to say we've gathered a lot of data, and as Lamar said, it's all available on the Clio Infra website, so do have a look and play around with it. There's all sorts of interesting things to tell. There's this story of progress. Important differences remain though. And what we found in How Was Life 2 really confirmed a lot of what we already see in How Was Life 1. And of course, there's some stuff about future work, about how we want to do even more research because, well, that's what researchers always want to do. I'm going to stop sharing now, and then I think by my own standards, I've done pretty well on time management.
You did really well. Thanks to the four of you for your presentations. Also, I must congratulate you for your report because so I read it with great pleasure. It's quite dense. It takes quite some time to go through all chapters, but I think it brings another perspective also for researchers working on a daily basis on quality of life, so such as we are. So I think it will bring something new which we can use also in our publications. I will start with the first question, which comes from Francesco. So I'm just going to read. The long run changes do not surprise me. What I find very interesting is that you document worsening inequality in various dimensions after 1950s and worrying trends for some indicators of quality of life after 1950s. Moreover, these worrying trends characterize mostly rich countries. Am I wrong? And if not, are you going to document this systematically in a publication? So whoever wants to answer this.
Shall I have a start, and then maybe I can imagine maybe Jan Luiter wants to follow up a bit. I would say the observation is correct. We see some changes in the trend, some slowdowns and some reversals, especially, let's say, in the last 2 decades or so. And indeed, for example, in working hours or in some of these inequality indicators, they also tend to be concentrated in the richer countries. So I would agree with that. Whether it's something we'll investigate more systematically in the future, I personally find it very interesting. We also have a research project focused on the Netherlands, where some of us are based, looking at these themes for the Netherlands and finding similar things. And this is very much focused on more recent data. Looking at the global data, of course, a lot of us are specialized in historical data, so we're not very likely to pick up on the more recent debate. We think sort of our added value is looking at these long-term trends. But it is definitely an interesting finding that also struck me and that is in need of some further attention.
Yeah, there is, of course, a big debate about the links between globalization and inequality in the last 40 or 50 years, since the 1970s and 1980s. And it has been documented very well for a lot of countries that inequality has been increasing a lot in those decades. And I think that's what you also see in not only the income inequality and the wealth inequality, but to some extent also in the length of life inequality measures that we have presented. So it's a much more general phenomenon than we thought initially. So it's a very widespread return of inequality, you might almost say, in the last decades of the 20th century.
Thanks. So we have Peter Krause, who's thanking you for the presentation and who's asking which lessons should be taken from these results for forecast scenarios. So what to do with this data in the future.
Well, historians, for very good reasons, are not very eager to extrapolate their trends into the future, because we know that things might change. And we have seen recently, of course, that there have been dramatic changes which were quite unexpected for many of us in all fields of economic and social life. So I think that at the moment we are, perhaps already since 2008, when we had the big financial crisis, this trend towards globalization and increased inequality has come to an end. And there are now other trends in the world economy which are emerging, but which are very difficult to well, to analyze, because they are simply not very clear from a historical perspective. So as historians, we need 20 or 30 or 40 years in order to really understand what's happening. And it is very difficult to predict what this end of globalization, if I may call it that, and this new realignment of economic forces, the rise of China, well, you can mention a lot of different Brexit, populism, there are all kinds of different trends which are now emerging, but they are, it's very difficult to predict what the results on economic growth and on inequality will be. So I'm happy to leave this to economists and others who are more qualified to speculate about the future.
I would just say sort of more qualified and maybe also more adventurous. And it is a very interesting question in the sense that, and it's something we haven't really looked at, whether sort of the predictions and forecasts, let's just say 10, 20 years in the future, look very different once you start taking into account the sort of added information in this sort of long-term data. So I think it's an interesting exercise in a way, and I'd be interested to see what it brings.
If I may add, I mean, economic historians are adventurous enough when they go so far back in time for African countries or other countries with very few data. So we cannot make their life even more complicated asking them to come up with forecasts. But and even at the OECD, where to some extent, you know, we have been moving this agenda forward, we never ventured in a way of forecast beyond some work that is done by our colleagues in the futures unit at the OECD. They are building scenarios, but they are not, of course, forecast beyond the narrow economic variable. Where there is a lot of interest and attention currently, even at the OECD, is to try to come up with some estimates that reduce the time lag between the latest historical data and where we currently are. Most of this inequality data are simply water under the bridge for policymakers, though they refer to things that happened 3-4 years ago. Even with the best of our effort to reduce these lags, though it remains a huge challenge for statistical offices. We have seen it very clearly in the current context of the post-COVID. There is a lot of appetite, interest to know what has happened to poverty, to financial vulnerability of households. It's very hard to come to terms. We are currently engaged in some work to nowcast, but which we would be happy enough to know where we are now without venturing in where we are in the future, even for basic things like income inequality, where some of our latest data refer to 2018 or 2019.
It's true that you were adventurous to go that far in the past in the policy report. So I have two questions. I'll start with the second simply because it is for Auke, who will leave us in 10 minutes. So Kelsey O'Connor is asking, on slide 21, you show a curvilinear relationship between the composite indicator and GDP per capita. Is this the cross-sectional relationship? And have you looked at changes over time in composite indicator and GDP per capita?
There's the old forgot to mute again. Another classic. So the first part is very easy. This is indeed the cross-sectional relationship, pooling all the data, but also if you do this separately for a number of sub-periods, you sort of start seeing, you sort of have similar patterns. Whether we've also looked extensively at the changes in time between the relation in the composite indicator and GDP per capita. We've worked on, so the answer is yes, kind of, but I'm not going to be able to give all the results from the top of my head. So with Jan Luijten and Marco, we also worked on a working paper looking at these long-term trends, and very specifically whether there are any changes in the relationship between GDP per capita and well-being components. And like I said, it's sort of difficult to get all the results from the top of my head, but I'm just going to say that the relationship is definitely not stable. So I can give one thing I can tell you for sure is that and that's also sort of what the correlation coefficients we showed elsewhere showed, is that at the very early period, so let's say 1820 till at least 1870, 1880, but a bit further as well, I think, you see that the relationship between GDP per capita and these well-being outcomes, but also the composite indicator in general, is pretty flat. There's no strong relationship. It's only as the 20th century progresses that this positive relationship comes into being.
Maybe something we could add, that because we discussed it, Jan-Louis and Oke, this cross-country correlation, they are based on the number of countries changes through time. And so it is not a correlation that that strictly controls, is limited to the same country, number of countries over time. So, the two elements are playing out together in the chart that Oke has shown.
Yes, you'd like a constant group of countries to look at to make sure that the addition of new countries to the data doesn't skew it. But of course, you do end up with the problem that say you want to start this analysis in 1870. That's not even being super strict. Then of course, pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa, with maybe the exception of one or two countries, one of them being South Africa, would just not be in the correlation at all. So it'll also create biases of its own. But it's a bit tricky. That's the eventual conclusion, maybe.
We have Iqbal Hussain, who is asking if the inequality of opportunity was covered, and I don't think I have seen it in the report, in any indicators of quality of life. Was it in the report somewhere, inequality of opportunity?
That depends a bit on how you define this. And this is often defined in terms of social mobility of people, and then that is not included in the report. It's also not included in the How is Life report, if I am correct. So it's not one of the criteria, and it would be very difficult to measure this in a systematic way for different countries in different regions, different time periods. It would be a real challenge, but it would be worthwhile to do that. But there are no studies available which have tried to do this in the, so it's difficult to get that kind of information. You really have to follow people through their careers and then compare with their parents. And so that's quite a challenging project to measure this in a systematic way. And
also, if I may add, the opportunities will, they will play out differently in different spheres of life. We have all been used to use, including at the OECD, this measure of earnings elasticity between parents and their children, which shows some very interesting results. But still, earning, it is a partial measures of people's well-being. And you could think that in every life dimension, you could have different type of indicator of equality of opportunity that could be developed and play a role.
Mm-hmm. I'll add one very quick addition, is that what you see, there's a couple of studies out there which look at this intergenerational mobility, which Marco and Jan-Louis also mentioned, on the basis of occupations, occupational status in particular, and that tends to be available for a pretty long time period. But this is really restricted to a pretty small number of countries. I think the United States and Britain stand out. I would imagine the Netherlands and Sweden will find something as well. But if you try to be more global, which is really one of the things we really want to do in these reports, yeah, it becomes very difficult very quickly.
Mm-hmm. I do have a question, and also a bit of it's a comment as well. We often see the work of the authors, but we don't always see the work of the editors. And the editors, I find in this report, it's a remarkable job, because the chapters are very consistent, you know, from one to another. And in particular, what I found very interesting is this reflection upon the quality of the data that is systematically done in the chapters. And it's, again, it's at the same time very insightful and very, I could imagine, quite challenging. How did you, it's maybe a question at the same time for the editors and maybe for the authors as well, if Lamar want to say something as well about it. How did you, so you define it, so when it's a top quality, it's a statistical office, it's originated from statistical office, and it's a 1 or a 4, I don't remember. And then you see it varies across space and time. But yeah, how could you, was it that easy to classify, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 in all of these chapters?
Well, I mean, the classification is done by individual authors. Now, what we as editor insisted at the beginning already in the first volume was the need to provide some indicator of quality, because we may produce numbers, but all these numbers may need to be used with different grains of quantity of salt on them. I think that if we, I don't know if there will be now is life, was life free in the future, but I mean, one reflection that we could have, I mean, the criteria for which we assess quality, maybe they deserve some further thinking. I mean, at the OECD there is a framework for assessing the quality of statistics that are produced, which use different criteria than the one that you see in the volume. And I would say that there are, when you look at individual chapters, there are often different issues that come to the fore and questions that even as editors, you don't have all the elements for answering. For example, because now that we have the advantage of having Lamar here, one issue that I remember in discussion with Angus Deaton, he often stressed is how incomplete death tables and death register are across countries. Now, he raised this point mainly for developing countries, in particular with Africa. But I imagine that when you go back to 1820, the share of death of people who died in a given year that is covered by one of your tables probably, it changes over time and is not always equally high. It could be that in one country you have data for the capital city, in other countries you have this data for other provincial towns, and yet in another you start including the urban areas. So probably, this is an aspect of quality that is important, and that is where we could have documented more in the chapters and in further research.
Mark, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah, no, exactly. So the basic relationship between how we give data quality to different observations, it just depends on to what extent indeed parts of these life tables were estimated based on either the past or the future, or trends elsewhere. So actually, even statistical offices we consider to be of lower quality than a specialized database, human mortality database, I believe. So yeah, again, you see that these choices depend on the author. And yes, for the least quality observations, it is simply the case that much of the information has been estimated, or assumptions have been made. For instance, if you're working in age categories from 20 to 25, and you know that somebody has passed away in that age category, you don't know if they passed away at the age of 20 or the age of 25. So already there, you're going to have to make some assumption regarding when they died. Of course, also, these life tables, especially early on, they used to be limited. So not many people would live past 85 years. So of course, statistical offices were not going to check how many people died at the age of 90 or the age of 100. They would just limit it at 85 plus. And that of course also impacts inequality, the inequality measure, depending on how you change these life tables.
Thanks. So Luxembourg is boiling with questions. Kelsey is asking that, so biodiversity is included in the reports and something that shows negative trend, which opposes the overall positive message. Maybe you can say something a bit more about it and how important it is.
Jan-Uit, I'm very briefly going to interrupt you because you're definitely going to answer this, of course, but I have to get going now. So it was, I just want to thank everyone and say bye. And if there are any remaining questions for me, feel free to send them to me via email and I'll have a look at them tomorrow. Okay.
Thanks for coming, okay.
Yes, thanks everyone. Good luck with the last bits.
Biodiversity was covered in this report and also in the previous one. In the previous one, we used mean species abundance as estimated by the Globio 3 model, which has been developed by a number of scholars, biologists to model biodiversity change in the long run. So that has been the systematic estimates that we have used, presented in the first report. In the second report, we have added a lot of additional thoughts and ideas about how to measure biodiversity. And we have experimented with one method applied to the Netherlands in the long run, between 1900 and 2015. But we did not produce new global estimates of biodiversity change. We did use the Living Planet Index as created by World Wildlife Fund, and we've also presented that kind of data, but we did not make a separate estimates for the entire world.
And I think we'll take this last question of Francesco, and then maybe Jill, you want to close because we'll arrive on time. So the polity indicator seems to tell a success story. Can you describe it in a bit more detail, how it's observed, and does its composition change over time? You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, this is also part of the volume 1. It's the level of democracy as measured via the share of the population which is voting, the share of the population which is allowed to vote, and comparable indicators. Of course, at the moment, we hardly can think about a positive trend in democracy and the quality of political institutions for reasons which are obvious if you look around you in the political field. But in the very long run, there is a strong upward trend in the quality of political institutions in the 19th and in the 20th century. But there are dips, and the 1930s and 1940s was such a huge dip in our series, and we are now experiencing another dip in the series, which is a problem. But if the long-term trend continues, then we might expect that things will move to a more favorable situation in the future. Mm-hmm. Again, that's speculating about the future, and I'm not supposed to do that.
Yes, you said you would not, but yes, indeed, which shows again the complexity of the report with all these indicators going in different directions. I think it's very, very rich. So I think we're done here. We said we would try to finish on time. So thanks to 3+1 as Auke left. I will just maybe leave Jill to say a final word, and well, hoping that we do this again, and maybe also for How Was Life 3.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. On behalf of ISQOLS, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees for taking the time to enjoy this wonderful presentation. Just as a reminder, we'll be sending out an email at the end once everything is uploaded, and we'll send you all the details, the recording, and the presenter information. So again, thank you on behalf of ISQOLS, and we hope to see you all at an upcoming ISQOLS event, including our upcoming conference in August. With that, I will go ahead and end the webinar and say goodbye to everyone. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.